So one of the topics that we hear a lot about is a kind of a situation where you are an unintended landlord. And this is when you have space and you've got a guest who you can't seem to get rid of except through the eviction process. If you're in a situation where you've got a long-term guest who simply won't leave no matter how hard you ask, you're gonna want to stick around. We're talking all about evicting a long-term guest. Let's get started. So unfortunately, situations change, and sometimes that means that someone who was once welcomed onto your property has overstayed that welcome, and now you want them to go, but they refuse to leave. And it doesn't matter that you've asked them nicely. It doesn't matter even that you've sent them a written notice. They're not going to budge until, in their own words, you drag them out, or until you have a court order that requires them to leave. Because the truth is, somebody who's staying for free may not voluntarily leave because there's nothing better than free. And so their moving is going to require them to find a new place to live and require them to put up money in order to live there. Chances are they're going to stick around where it's free. But what can you do if it turns out you are an unintended landlord with a long-term guest who simply won't leave without you first evicting them? Why do I have to evict them at all? It's my house. Can't I just grab their stuff and toss it out? Probably not. And it's going to depend on a few factors. So I want you to consider these factors because they might make the difference as to whether or not you can use a more self-help method as opposed to whether your only option is using the courts. And so here are a few things that are under consideration in these scenarios. Have they established residency in your home? Have they lived there long enough that they're not just visiting anymore? Now they reside there. So there's no bright line test, but there are a few factors to consider. For example, do they get mail at your house? If someone has started receiving mail as your guest, it may mean that they now reside there and they think of your couch as their bedroom. If that's the case, you're probably in a situation where you have to evict. But in what other ways can you establish residency? Well, one very major way is if their driver's license or their ID card references your address as their residence. All of these tend to show that they at least understand your home to now be their place of residency. Another key for you to consider when a person considers themselves a resident in your home, how do they talk about the situation to other people? Do they refer to themselves as a guest, or do they refer to themselves as your roommate? Because what's in their mind and what they expect out of the situation is extremely important, and it could alter the perception, definitely of the court, in terms of how to resolve this particular stay. Is it a short-term guest stay, or is it a tenancy? So another big factor as to whether or not you have a guest as opposed to a tenant is whether or not they have ever paid anything in exchange for the right to stay there. This agreement can often look very, very informal. In fact, sometimes a buddy will agree to cover the grocery bill or cover the light bill or cover some other payment that you don't think of as rent, but that they consider as part of their obligation in exchange for the right to stay in your home. And so it could be that you create a kind of contract which would be a lease that would allow them, in exchange for X, Y, or Z, they get to stay. An easy one would be the house sitter. In exchange for staying, they're going to take care of your place and make sure that everything is tip-top, that nobody breaks in, maybe that your plants are watered or that your dog is walked. If they're exchanging their service for the right to stay on your property, you actually have a tenancy. And although it's completely oral, most states will allow an oral lease agreement. And so you're getting something in exchange for them staying on the property. That means you have a tenant. Of course, the easy one is if you and this long-term guest ever had some agreement, even a small agreement, or a small portion of what would otherwise be the rental value for your home if you tell them, hey, by the way, as long as you contribute $100 or $200 or $300, you can stay for as long as you need. Those words form an agreement, which is an oral lease. And as long as this roommate is keeping up with this, well, you've got a month-to-month tenancy that was created by your exchange. They give you some money and they can stay for as long as they need. And so because you've created this agreement system, you now have a tenant that, once you're tired of this tenancy, you can't just easily grab their stuff and toss them out. You're likely going to have to go through the entire eviction process, just like every other landlord. So I hope you found the content helpful so far. If that's the case, please click the like button below. Leave a comment if you have a question for me. And if you're not yet a subscriber, please consider subscribing, particularly as the content gets a little more complicated in today's topic. Not the least of which is if your long-term guest has stayed long enough that they make a claim that they are actually an owner. How does this happen? Well, it does. So let me give you a classic example. You have a couple of brothers, and one brother bought a piece of property and says to his other brother, say a year later, why don't you come live with me? I know things are tough out there. Why don't you come live with me? And if you contribute a little bit here and there, I'll let you stay for as long as you need. And sure enough, that brother comes in and does contribute. In fact, that brother contributes half of the mortgage payment every single month diligently for 10 years. Then at the end of the 10 years, the two brothers have a conversation, and it turns out that the second brother believes that he is a joint owner with his brother in that residence. That could get quite complicated, especially after that amount of time and the way that the agreement is set up. And I'll tell you that a lot of the cases that we deal with are fights between parties who are convinced that they have an ownership interest because of the behavior of the parties, possibly from conversations that the parties have had before. And of course, nothing is ever well documented. And so these fights can linger for a long time and get very, very expensive. And the person who is at the most risk is the homeowner. By not having a very clear understanding of what you and your guests are involved in, you might have yourself in a situation where you've just opened the door for years of very complicated and very messy litigation. So the last situation is probably the stickiest. It's one where the parties were actually romantic partners. And whenever you've got a situation where parties are in a romantic situation, in states that allow common law marriage, you've got a particularly complicated potential claim. If the homeowner enters into a relationship, and it doesn't matter where they are in terms of the payment of the home, maybe it's a recent purchase, maybe it's been in process for a while, maybe the place is completely paid off. But if you live in a state that allows for common law marriage, the fact that you and a partner are together for an extended amount of time, whether you were officially married or not, could open the door for a claim that now this home isn't just some place where the guest stays, it is the marital home. And you open up all sorts of very complicated litigation that, a real estate attorney alone can't handle. Now you're talking about family law. And so we're no longer just in the realm of real estate law. Now you got to go into the family code for your state, and you have to resolve whether or not the requisite elements are met for a common law marriage. Again, those are going to vary from state to state, and I'm certainly not a family law attorney, and so I don't counsel clients in these situations. Instead, what I've seen is one of two things. Either A, we begin an eviction process where a party has said, my roommate and I have decided to split ways, but they won't leave, and so I want to send them a notice. And so we always ask, Are you involved in a romantic relationship? Have you ever been involved in a romantic relationship? I said, yeah, but that was a while back and it's no longer a thing. And so we always warn our clients is, look, in these situations, they could make this claim. Many times they don't, but sometimes they do. And once that claim is made in a Texas court, that eviction judge doesn't have jurisdiction to decide whether or not these two people are actually married. And so now the case has to get pulled into a different court with competent jurisdiction, and that matter has to be resolved before the eviction is ever resolved. And guess what? You may be stuck long term with a party while you are getting a divorce from them in a completely other court. So yes, these things can happen. And so what is the solution to all of these? Well, naturally, if you leave everything in an oral agreement, you know, everything's in the wind, everything's in the ether, nothing is very secure. And because of that, all sorts of claims can potentially be made. So either A, don't let anybody live with you unless you are going to marry them, or B, anybody who does stay, even for a short term, you really have to strongly consider before you allow them in whether or not it's important for you to sign a lease document that clearly identifies the boundaries of that stay. You know, everybody likes doing favors for friends and family until they get burned by these situations. And I've dealt with so many of these that naturally for me, I've always got that alert going that whenever someone needs a place to stay, and you see no reasonable prospect for them going someplace else in the very near future, you may have a long-term guest on your hands. And if you're willing to do that, then you should also be willing to establish even a simple lease agreement between you both. One that definitely kicks out the idea of any shared ownership interest, one that definitely institutes some kind of agreement, a quid pro quo. In exchange for staying, they will do X, Y, or Z, even if that means payment of rent or some activity or some service that they can provide in exchange for the right to stay. Now, in certain situations, that's just not going to work. I mean, grandma's coming over and she's 105 years old. That's a very different situation than if your cousin's coming over in his early 20s and may not leave until he's 35. That could make for some really, really uncomfortable family situations, which again, can be cleared up with a simple lease document. If you are in a situation where you presently have a long-term guest, you're gonna wanna seek out local counsel to make sure, you know, maybe you've got to institute an eviction before you can get rid of them. Of course, a lot of times these situations can be cleared up with a demand letter. And sometimes when somebody receives a demand letter from a law firm, they're gonna be more likely to respond to it and pack up and leave. Other times they're gonna say, nope, I know what my rights are, and the only way you're gonna get me out of here is with a court order. If that's the case, and you're not exactly sure how to get there, I strongly recommend that you seek out local counsel. Definitely, if you are in Texas, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is below. We are happy to help. Again, even the unintentional landlord, we're happy to help you get your property back. I hope this video has been helpful to you. I know that YouTube thinks this video right here is the next best thing that you can watch. I welcome you to check that out along with the rest of our content. And until next time, happy leasing.